Hi everyone, Jim Watson here from Rabobank. Cheers and thanks for joining me today. I'm going to give a quick overview of the coffee landscape right now and from the consumer and the brand side, and try to focus a little bit on the retail side of the business and where specialty coffee might fit in there. My role on the research side at Rabobank is looking at all beverages with a focus on coffee. So I am going to try to bring in a few observations from some of the other beverage segments as well. The first thing we're going to talk about is just the overall beverage landscape right now and the massive disruption to total buying patterns that we're seeing. Then I'm going to move on to dig in a little bit deeper on the coffee side at retail and some of the kind of interesting patterns we're seeing there. And then last, I'm going to talk about where especially specialty coffee might go in the future in terms of breaking into retail in a bigger way and some of the different models it might follow. So the first thing I want to talk about, though, to set the scene is how much of beverage consumption comes in the on-premise. And this is one of the most important things to understand, just to look at what volumes are doing right now for different coffees. And so you can see on this chart that most beverages are fairly consistent in the U.S. Around 20% of the volume goes to the on-premise. But we do have this data from the Brewers Association here, which is pretty interesting, that craft beer is 40% on-premise. And I'm including it because I think one of the things that's important is specialty coffee probably follows a somewhat similar pattern in that a specialty, a craft consumer is going to be more on premise. It's less exposed. It hasn't broken into retail in the same way. And so, who is winning in this massive move to the on premise? And it's worth saying that, move to the off premise. It's worth saying that the move to the off premise is primarily so far a move to really big grocery chains and big box stores. And so, who wins in this category is big brands sold in big packages from big companies, at the big box stores. And that's just mostly a reflection of consumer buying patterns right now, right? So you're going to the stores that sell those packages, right? So some of this is just, you buy what's in the store you choose to go to, and consumers generally are spending less time in store shopping. There's still a little bit of a raised kind of fear around staying in a grocery store. So they're buying a familiar brand, or they're just buying something that they see in front of them without looking for new options nearly as much. And so, some of the brand side winners might be, brands that were doing well anyway, like a Starbucks and a Peet's, which have had volume at retail up massively. But equally, Maxwell House and Folgers saw, certainly in the month of April, a massive spike in volume. But what's interesting, and we think a lot of those type of new buying patterns won't necessarily last post, these first few months of a COVID crisis. And we've already seen Folgers and Maxwell House volumes, return to decline. So they've been in years of decline, and now they're going right back to that. If we look at this next chart, we'll see the overall volumes across multiple different beverage sectors. And I do think, it's really interesting to look at everything together. We see alcohol kind of at the top, which is fairly interesting. And so certainly spirits number one. And so, you can think one of the factors driving which categories are doing better is a little bit of demographics. A spirits drinker might be a little bit more well off, less impacted by a recession right now. Coffee's in the middle of the pack. I think an important factor to consider in how coffee is doing at retail right now is probably we're missing a lot of Ecommerce data, and Ecommerce is probably better for coffee than any other beverage on this chart. So certainly any spikes we're seeing there are less captured in this data. So coffee may be doing better than this overall. But one of the interesting things is, so you see this coffee volume up 20 to 30%. And it's worth saying the last 2 months we've seen this kind of level off. So I think this is a little bit of a consistent rate that will now be driven to change by the rate of reopening. But at this rate, grocery stores, so 30% more volume is a lot. They're struggling with their supply chain. So they're struggling with out of stocks. What this means for the beverage industry as a whole is the retailers and distributors are looking to reduce the number of SKUs they carry. And this is probably something they've said for a long time, but when out of stocks are, the most important thing, then you're just going to try to be as efficient as possible. So we've heard retailers saying, we're going to pick the top 25 brands in a given category and carry extra inventory of those. We'll make sure we never go out of stock there. And that's something that we do think is going to stick around probably for the medium term. And at the same time, we've heard, category resets aren't happening. So this is when a retailer introduces new brands. So, again, these are going to be delayed, but they're going to come back at some point. But for the meantime, who does this benefit? Again, it benefits bigger players. So if you're in the top 25 already, you're going to be secure, and you might have an actually a better place. Equally, if you're trying to break into the segment, there are going to be less opportunities to do it. The long tail still has value. So we had this debate on the beer side saying, okay, if you eliminate these SKUs, does this hurt everybody? And one of the counter arguments was the long tail was there because it provided value, because that's what consumers were looking for in the first place. And so one of our core beliefs out of COVID is that the base consumer desires for drinks won't change. If you want to discover a novelty out of your coffee or your beer, you're going to want that, in the end. And so there may be a temporary dip in how much of a long tail can get represented in retail, but we do think that's going to come back over time, because if that's what consumers really want, then the retailers are going to provide that for them. So from here, I want to move on to the second section and dive a little bit more directly into the coffee side. And so, I'm putting up a chart here that shows this is scanner data, and it shows the different growth categories within coffee. So I took the four biggest categories basically at retail. So it's whole bean, specialty, roasting ground, and instant coffee. And so you see overall coffee up a significant amount. But I think what's interesting here is whole bean has shown by far the best growth, and instant showed a big spike in volume as well, though it's come down a little bit. So I wanted to focus on those two categories because they're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So whole bean is at retail the most premium side of coffee. And so what I think is interesting about this is that this one might stick around a little bit more long term. Like, this could be a structural change. And I say that because we're seeing a massive increase in equipment, like basically grinders being bought for home. So you have people buying the equipment, learning or relearning the skills, and maybe even going for a subscription coffee service, which is kind of a sticky form of getting coffee. And so when we look at those together, we think this might be something that has legs, and basically you're acquiring the infrastructure to do it for the long term. So we think this category is great, and it actually matches with what we see in the overall coffee global landscape. This was the first time when looking at the top markets around the world to identify where growth was, that whole bean coffee, it actually showed up in Germany as one of the top growth segments in the world, but it's the first time I've seen whole bean on there. So whole bean is still relatively small. It's roughly like a tenth the size of single cup or roasting ground at retail. So take this with a grain of salt that where this growth is coming from and how big it is. But we do see a number of signs that this could be the beginning of a much stronger move in whole bean coffee. The opposite probably for instant coffee. So instant coffee saw a huge spike early on, though we'll note that it kind of came off a little bit in the last 4 weeks. And this is probably recession effects that we're seeing. So this is just the basic trading down for consumers who can spend less. And our view is more or less that instant consumption, any increase here is going to be related to the recession, and then will go away after the recession. There isn't necessarily a structural driver that's going to make instant consumption any different down the road. Consumers aren't necessarily going to want it anymore. And I'm talking about the overall instant category, not necessarily specialty instant, which I think is much smaller, but an interesting place in and of itself. So the question is, does this start to look like premiumization? And who does it look like premiumization to? And so we'll say whole bean is doing really well, but even single cup is doing better than roasting ground. So basically, the more expensive styles of coffee are all doing better at retail right now. So if you were a roaster, does this look like premiumization? And we'd say it actually might start to look like premiumization, depending on the margins that you sell into a coffee shop versus sell into retail. But it's definitely there, and that's a very interesting thing, because normally if we were entering a recession, as an analyst, my first thought is always, everybody's going to trade down in a recession. We've seen this before. That's the story, but we're seeing something different here, and a lot of that comes from, if you're a consumer and you were buying, 5 coffees a week at a coffee shop, and now you're taking that consumption into your home, realistically, you could spend a fair bit less money, but buy better beans for home. So you could do something that looks like premiumization, buying better beans, even while spending so much less overall. The story is never quite that simple. If we look at the specialty coffee retailer price index, they've seen at the really high end the biggest price drop so far. So kind of a little bit different than what we're seeing, when I say retail, talking about like big grocery chains and big box stores. So it's never that easy to say, as things move into grocery, does this really count as premiumization? But I think, at least compared to other recessions, this is going to be a little bit different, with a little bit more opportunity at the higher end, if not the very highest end. And so I want to switch to another chart here. That's a barbell chart. So this is a really, I guess, a bubble chart of coffee brands. And so I took the top 20 roasting ground brands in the US, and the bigger the bubble, the bigger the brand. And then I graphed it by, the price point versus the percentage growth over the last 2 months. And so what I wanted to look at here is, just within one category, we've seen premiumization. What does it look like? So I think what's interesting about the effect here is we'll see at the low end, there's a little bit of growth. As you move into the middle price points, it's actually probably the weakest section of the chart. I mean, the brands aren't as big here, so there's already been that hollowing out of the middle. But then if you go to the premium end, it's clear that the premium end is driving most of the growth in coffee, certainly just in roasting ground in this small sample set. And we'll admit this is a bit of a noisy data to have only 20 brands in there. But I think what we see here is a little bit of a divergence between two consumer groups that are going through totally different things right now. So on the low end side, you have consumers that are directly affected by the recession. They lost their job, they have job insecurity. They are going to look to spend less, if possible, on coffee. We do believe coffee demand is fairly inelastic. People will continue to drink, but those facing tougher economic times will trade down. But there's obviously a massive group of consumers who, if you're still employed and have job security, you're not spending on the on-premise, you're not going out to events or travel. You may have a lot more disposable income right now. So we're seeing a little bit of that move to higher end brands here. And it does seem, maybe that consumers are trying to bring their brands home. So I think a lot of what we see at retail you would be described as consumers trying to either recreate a coffee shop experience if they're used to that specialty coffee shop, or just bring the brands they know home with them. If they can't go out to a Starbucks, they're going to buy a Starbucks brand coffee for home, kind of pushing a slightly more premium look in the grocery store. But one of the things that's interesting is you're trying to pull your brands home with you, but you kind of have to look what brands are actually in the retail store. And so this is, I want to get into the last section, which is basically, where can specialty coffee go within this retail arena, and what are some different models? Because my first observation is that specialty coffee is massively underrepresented in a core grocery store, certainly in a big box store. And we have a situation where everyone right now really across beverages is reevaluating their business model. Like, are we finding the right route to go to a consumer? Clearly, if you were all on premise, this is a prime question. And we're wary of overreacting. We don't want to suddenly say, scrap your business model, do something totally new when, the on-premise will return at some point. But we do think it's time to take a hard look. So we've kind of established the demand is there for premium, right? So we saw people moving up in terms of the different categories of coffee they're drinking. We also saw within a given category, like roasting ground, people moving up. So we know people want better coffee. You can see almost no local coffee brands in the grocery store. But if you go down the beer aisle, it's going to be flooded with craft beer options. So yes, the big players, Anheuser-Busch, will have plenty of shelf space, but there will be even more for all of craft beer. Coffee doesn't look like that at all. My local coffee shop has only global and national brands outside of literally one local roaster. So if you were to say coffee could follow the beer model, what would that look like? Or why does it work for beer is the first question. And you'd say beer has distributors that can do this. So beer, if you're a craft beer, you go through probably one or a couple different distributors who will handle multiple craft beer brands, who can really handle the relationships with the retailer on a much more meaningful basis. And you also have massive pull from the retailers at this point. Now, that's chicken or egg. The craft brewers had to break into retail first, and now they provide such a higher margin than a big pack of Bud Light that I think that's going to be a little bit more appealing to a retailer. So what does that mean for coffee? Now, an individual coffee shop or a really small roaster might not have the scale to do anything with a bigger retailer. And one of the things you have to be able to do really consistent products, consistent innovation as well. So it's a big undertaking to work with a retailer. But this may be a place where either a bigger roaster can work locally, or a number of coffee shops can team up to work with a program with a retailer looking for more local, right? Beer works because consumers are looking for that local connection. That same thing could happen in coffee. And in fact, we think a lot of the craft beer consumer looks a lot like the specialty coffee consumer. So there's no doubt that there's that desire there. And we also say that, I've been shocked personally hearing even massive companies like Walmart talk about new programs within, let's say, the last 3 to 5 years of really aggressively taking on small up-and-coming brands in the non-alc space. So almost, all of these big companies understand that that's where a lot of growth comes from, especially high margin growth. And they have programs in place to look for new brands and help develop them. So I definitely think that's one of the ways that local coffee could crack into the retail space. But I also want to consider following the wine model. And so wine's ability to get to consumers has always been far more of a direct to consumer. So if you think about a ton of high-end wineries, their entire business model is a tasting room plus a mailing list, direct to consumer kind of wine club. And so there's a lot of overlaps in terms of the way coffee thinks of itself at the high end, working on wonderful rare varietals, trying to get similar to coffee in that front. So I think there's a lot of natural overlap there. And certainly for wine and retail, the grocery store is a fairly big channel, but isn't nearly as great or not nearly as high end. So as we talk about things coming from the on-premise to the off-premise, certainly for something like wine, that would be generally that's trading down. The brands you're selling in grocery aren't quite as high end. But the thing to think about in terms of wine getting out there, and this is perhaps less getting into direct retail, but thinking about getting into e-commerce is, we've been tracking e-commerce across all the alcohol space. And so basically food is, as a category, is the least represented in e-commerce. And then within that, beverages is a fair bit better. Within that, wine is one of the best of the alcohols, but then coffee is even better than that already. So there are two parts of e-commerce that I think are worth thinking about in terms of specialty wine breaking out to consumers in a way outside of the coffee shop. One is that direct to consumer, which is really the wine model, is very effective for the long tail, very effective for smaller shops. But one of the biggest areas of growth we see is growth of big grocery stores moving into e-commerce. So right now they've generally been really bad at it. But COVID, online delivery has gotten so much more investment. We talked to companies where their e-commerce department was sort of begging for resources 6 months ago, and now they've got every senior person at the organization asking, what do you need to grow? So we see that as one of the biggest areas of growth within e-commerce is going to be selling a grocery store or a platform like Instacart selling the products they already stock out through their own system. And so when we think about taking advantage of an e-commerce wine model there, one of the things we tell this to wine companies, we'd also say to coffee companies, is to take advantage of the most growth in e-commerce, you probably need to have something in with a retailer as that avenue begins to grow as well. The last thing I'll talk about in terms of specialty coffee kind of breaking into retail or e-commerce is I just want to focus on innovation for a second and say, I wouldn't expect specialty coffee to make huge inroads in the roasting ground section at their retailer because that's not where innovation is really being seen too much, right? And so generally across categories, if you're coming in at the high end, you're coming in with a new style offering. So I think of things more like all of the specialty instant. So literally specialty instant or steeped coffee bags or kind of frozen specialty single cup offerings. There's so many different kind of unique ways that none of the big guys are doing to the same degree that are higher margin that will bring consumers into a retail shop that's something they don't already have that'll be pretty unique and that's where specialty would come in. If I think about like why does craft beer succeed is because they're offering the massive range of flavors that the big guys really don't or can't provide. So when retailers want to give all those options, in coffee, the range of options in retail really isn't that great. So they're going to be looking to specialty coffee to provide some of those range of totally new coffee, ideas to consumers. And we're starting to see those come out in the market, but I think they have a real home, at retail. I'll finish here and just encourage you, if you have any questions or want to chat more about this, you can reach right out to me. I'd also say we have a podcast, my beverage team and I, called the Liquid Assets Podcast. So we cover all beverages from the business angle. Feel free to listen in, and if you have ideas for future episodes, please let me know. Thank you so much for joining me today.